Hello, this is Professor Neil Hamilton from the Drake University Agricultural Law Center with another installment in our series, Law for Landowners, 10 Things You Should Know. The topic today is 10 things landowners should know about working with the USDA NRCS, or the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Well, the nation has had its attention on soil erosion and land degradation since the time of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. And the agency that's responsible for dealing with our soil conservation policy is the NRCS. That's why it's important for landowners to understand how you can go about working with the NRCS and to have a basic understanding of their programs. Well, the first point to keep in mind is this historic role that the NRCS plays in soil conservation. It was originally the Soil Conservation Service, or the SCS, when it was created in the 1930s, and it has evolved just as our nation's soil conservation policies and programs have evolved. Till today, a broad range of technical assistance and cost sharing, land retirement programs, and other new initiatives to deal with soil conservation and water quality. Those are the things that are administered by the NRCS. The NRCS offices are found in almost every county in the nation, and certainly in every county in Iowa, and they're oftentimes co-located with the Farm Services Agency, or the FSA, of the USDA. You may also find the local soil and water conservation districts in those same offices. The NRCS is responsible for implementing the various conservation programs that are created by Congress in the Farm Bill. And so, for example, the 2018 Farm Bill, which was approved in late December 2018, creates a number of changes in soil conservation programs, which the NRCS will now be responsible for developing and implementing. Well, a second point to keep in mind is understanding the relationship between the NRCS and the county soil and water conservation districts. In the 1930s, when Congress began our attention to soil and water conservation, they passed a law that encouraged each state to have its own soil and water conservation law and to create a network of local county soil and water conservation districts. Iowa enacted that law, and we have soil and water conservation districts in all of our counties. In fact, we have 2 in Pottawatomie County, so we have 100. The local soil and water conservation districts are administered by an elected body of commissioners, and the Soil and Water Conservation District is responsible for implementing the state law on conservation, including some of the state cost sharing. Now, the NRCS and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts operate out of the same offices. And in fact, the employees may be locally funded, state funded, or you have federal employees. So it can sometimes be a little confusing. But the important point to recognize is the soil and water conservation districts are responsible for the state programs, and the NRCS is responsible for the federal programs. Well, a third point to keep in mind is recognizing the distinction between the NRCS and the FSA, or the Farm Services Agency. Well, FSA is really the agency that's responsible for administering what's known as the safety net, the various types of counter-cyclical payments and other forms of financial assistance, as well as some farm lending programs. Whereas the NRCS administers the cost sharing and technical assistance of the conservation programs. There is one conservation program, the Popular Conservation Reserve Program, that the FSA is involved in administering, but the NRCS still is involved in establishing the standards for that program. Well, the fourth idea to keep in mind is recognizing the main responsibilities of the NRCS. And the best way to describe that is to say that the NRCS is responsible for implementing the nation's goals and priorities when it comes to soil conservation. The 1985 Farm Bill included a conservation title that established many of the nation's primary goals when it comes to soil conservation. These include such ideas as Swamp Buster, designed to prevent the draining of wetlands for the purposes of planting crops, Sod Buster, which was designed to protect fragile ground that had never been plowed, and also the Conservation Compliance Program, which is based on the concept of HEL, or highly erodible land. For land that's designated as highly erodible, farmers and landowners are to have in place a conservation plan to be able to farm that land to limit the amount of erosion. The NRCS administers these various programs in part through the use of a form, the AD 1026, which all landowners have to have signed at least once, and which, if you're making changes in your farm, you may need to sign annually. This form certifies that the landowner is in compliance with the various programs and hasn't, for example, drained a swamp or planted crops on any fragile land that hasn't been plowed recently. One of the important things to remember, though, is that participation in the various USDA programs, such as the price support loans or even crop insurance, are voluntary, meaning that the government can't force you to participate. But on the other hand, if you choose to participate, that's when you need to actually certify your compliance with the soil conservation laws. A landowner could choose not to certify, but remember, if you do, you won't be eligible for a range of federal programs, including crop insurance. A fifth point to recognize is understanding the most common and popular programs that the NRCS has for landowners. These can be divided into several different categories. Certainly you have the programs that are based on long-term land retirement, like the Conservation Reserve Program, in which landowners are paid an annual payment to take out of production fragile land that would otherwise be subject to erosion. You also have what are known as the Working Lands programs, such as EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, that makes available cost sharing and other financial support for the installation and implementation of soil conservation practices. And you have the Conservation Stewardship Program, or the CSP, which pays people to add additional conservation practices on their farm. In addition, the USDA operates a number of programs that involve establishing permanent conservation easements on property. Formerly the WRP program, or the Wetland Reserve Program, was a widely used example, as is a farmland protection program. Well, all of those easement programs have been combined together into an agricultural easement initiative, but it's important to recognize that these programs involve permanent retirement and permanent transfer of conservation easement interests to the government in exchange for what is usually fairly significant financial payments. The sixth point to recognize is that the NRCS makes available education, technical assistance, and maintains web-based resources to help landowners understand these programs and to consider what opportunities may be available for them. If you have questions or are interested in learning more about what the NRCS does, I encourage you to go to their website. They have very rich and helpful materials that let you understand what's available, what's involved in applying, and what it may mean for you and your farm operation. The NRCS has a very useful tool called 5 Steps to Assistance, and it's designed as a portal for farmers and landowners to access these different programs. And it takes you through what are essentially the 5 steps of participation. These are planning, application, eligibility, ranking, and implementation. So the seventh point to recognize is understanding what the relationship between landowners and the NRCS can be. Primarily, it's one of education and assistance. The NRCS staff provides technical assistance, such as helping landowners develop conservation plans. They provide planning assistance, such as helping design practices that can be put on the land, such as installing terraces and grass waterways. And they provide general education about how to deal with questions of soil erosion and conservation and related issues. So to summarize, the support and involvement of the NRCS involves technical assistance, can involve financial assistance, and can also involve long-term protections, all designed to work with interested landowners on a voluntary basis to implement soil and water conservation practices. The eighth point to keep in mind is, again, recognizing that the NRCS programs are voluntary. Not all landowners are interested in protecting their lands and dealing with soil conservation. The NRCS is trying to change that, of course, and if you contact them, you will find them very interested in working with you. For many of the NRCS programs, landowners have to apply, and the eligibility and the availability of participation may be determined on some type of ranking. That is, based on what type of conservation and environmental benefits will be received by allowing this practice to be installed. It's also important to recognize, though, that some of the NRCS work, particularly the question of conservation compliance and determining whether or not a landowner or farmer is in compliance with soil conservation, may not look voluntary. Remember, you have to fill out this certification form, this AD 1026, for the FSA's purposes. But even though it may not appear voluntary, it is, because somebody could always choose not to participate in USDA programs. A ninth point for landowners to recognize is that if you use USDA funds, essentially public or federal money, on your land to install conservation practices, such as building a pond or putting in terraces, then there's an obligation that goes along with using those funds. For any of these programs, there's going to be a legal contract that's going to be created between the landowner and the USDA, typically referred to as a maintenance agreement. And in that maintenance agreement, there's going to be a provision that says the landowner agrees to maintain the practices for a set period of years. That period of years may be a function of the practices that is involved, but if it's a permanent conservation practice like a terrace, that may run for 20 years. And the point of the provision is that if something happens that the landowner or a subsequent landowner actually removes the practice, then the original landowner was responsible for repaying the government for the public funds. The idea is that since public cost-sharing funds are limited and are made available on application, it doesn't make sense to allow public funds to be spent and then a few years later to be wasted by having the practices removed. A 10th and final point to recognize is that the work of the NRCS continues to evolve. For example, their involvement in promoting the use of cover crops and dealing with issues like soil health. The NRCS is the nation's frontline agency when it comes to the ideas of working with landowners and farmers to protect their soil and improve their land. And in recent years, the work of the NRCS has evolved to include more attention to a range of environmental issues. For example, water quality. As we recognize in Iowa, there's much attention to the type of farming and conservation practices that can help protect water. Things like putting in buffer strips and planting cover crops. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that the NRCS is also very involved in these issues. Just just as it is in the new subject of dealing with soil health. In fact, there are 2 other videos in this series on those subjects: how landowners can work to improve soil health, and what landowners should know about being involved in a local watershed project. The point is that the NRCS's work will continue to evolve as it carries out its responsibility to work with landowners to help protect their land. This has been Professor Neil Hamilton from the Drake University Agricultural Law Center with today's episode of Law for Landowners, 10 Things You Should Know. And our subject has been working with the NRCS.